Hello everyone, happy Halloween and welcome to another Rewind review. In this video we're travelling back to the year 2003 to take a look at the first instalment of Underworld. Directed and co-written by Len Wiseman alongside Kevin Grievo and Danny McBride, Underworld follows Selene, a vampire warrior who is entrenched in a conflict between vampires and werewolves while falling in love with Michael, a human who is sought by werewolves for unknown reasons. The first instalment of the franchise stars Kate Beckinsale, Scott Speedman, Michael Sheen, Shane Brolly, Bill Nighy, Erwin Leder, Sophia Miles, Robbie G, Wentworth Miller and Kevin Grievo. When it comes to my own experience with this franchise, I'll admit I haven't really seen most of them. They don't often have the best reputation, and I'll be honest, out of the stuff that I have seen of them in the past, there was nothing about them that really grabbed me. I have seen this one once years ago purely out of curiosity, and I remember not really liking it that much outside of a few things here and there, and that's partly why I didn't really want to see any of the others. I did end up seeing, I think, the third one, Rise of the Lycans, and I remember liking that one a little bit more, but it still wasn't enough for me to want to check out the rest of the series. So now in 2023, the movie is turning 20 years old and I wanted to revisit this movie with a fresh perspective. And since it's Halloween season, I thought this was probably the best time to do it. So let's take a look at Underworld. The story for this movie follows a vampire called Selene who spends her time as something called a death dealer, aka a werewolf hunter. And on one night she meets a character called Michael who seems to be of particular interest to the leader of the Lycans. Through this encounter and an escalating desperation from the Lycans to get to Michael, Selene begins to uncover secrets from the past that may hold the key to ending a war that's been waged for centuries. The story for this movie is generally okay overall. It does have some pretty interesting ideas, but the biggest problem for me is that this is something that has absolutely been done before, and personally I think a little bit better. It does follow a lot of the cliches and the general direction that you would expect a movie like this to follow, and that can make it a little bit predictable. But they do throw a few interesting twists into this story, and I do like what it is that they do with them. It's also one of those films that's set in a world with a deep history and a lot of backstory and lore, and it does try to give you a good breakdown of what has happened via a load of exposition, which I don't normally mind too much, especially if it is handled well. Things like Lord of the Rings is a really good example of that. But considering that this movie is meant to be a horror action movie first and foremost, I was hoping for a little less of it. I think the biggest surprise for me was when I was researching this movie, and one of the things that I did actually come across was that apparently when it was originally pitched to the studio, it was pitched as Romeo and Juliet for vampires and werewolves. So there is this romantic element that is included in this movie, but I'll be honest, outside of a few flashback sequences, I don't really get that vibe. There is a relationship that does develop between Selene and Michael, but it doesn't feel like the natural direction for them as characters. It just kind of happens really fast and they barely spend any time together as well, so for me, I don't feel any investment in the relationship, and it does feel forced. It's still a better love story than Twilight though. Everything's a better love story than Twilight. The performances are alright though, with Kate Beckinsale in one of her earliest action roles as Selene, and Scott Speedman as the MacGuffin man, Michael Corvin. Kate is genuinely awesome as Selene. She's both badass and sexy in equal measure, with an interesting history with a character called Viktor that gets revealed over the course of the film. Kate's performance is pretty good overall. She does do what she can with the character, she looks cool, and she does get some pretty fun scenes. Selene might not have much in the ways of personality, and unfortunately that is kind of across the board with most of the characters in this movie, but I do think she is a memorable character and I would like to see more from her. Scott, on the other hand, not the best. He does have some memorable scenes, and his performance during the transformation scenes is pretty good, but character wise he is very passive, as he spends most of the movie either being chased by someone or being dragged around. They do try and give him a bit of backstory, but that's just in one scene of dialogue, which is pretty similar to what they do with Selene too, which is a bit of a shame because I do think that they could have used a few flashbacks to really fill in those gaps, and I think that they could have done some really interesting stuff with them. The movie does include flashbacks, so they're not against using them whatsoever, so use them. You know, show don't tell. Another thing that I was hoping that they would show a little bit more of was the horror. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't any horror whatsoever in this movie. There's a few grisly moments and the story is built around some scary creatures. But if I had to classify this movie in any particular genre, I'd be more inclined to say action than anything else. There's no proper frights or scares, and personally I think there is a lack of tension. But I will admit this does get fixed towards the end of the film during the final battle, which does become a little bit more tense. They really start playing around with shadows and there's actually a jump scare. It's not a brilliant jump scare by any means, but it is is used well. And speaking of being used well, now that was a great segue. Bill Nighy's in this movie playing a character called Viktor, and he's one of the older vampires known as an elder, and he is so much fun to watch. Bill Nighy does what Bill does best, with his little reactions, sometimes over the top deliveries, and a properly invested performance that chews up the scenery. His design is actually pretty cool, and the makeup looks pretty decent too, and that's across the board, to be honest. He does remind me of Snoke in the Star Wars sequels, and apparently the crew even called him the rock and roll vampire. I think they must have seen his Christmas album.
I feel it in my fingers, I feel it in my toes.
He is genuinely great, and he is easily one of the best parts of this movie. The other best part is Sheen playing a character called Lucian, who is the head of the Lycans. He's a very serious character, and he does stare a lot, maybe a little too much. Seriously, it became a little game just counting how many times he blinks. But in all honesty, what Sheen does with this role is pretty good. He brings the right amount of energy and drama for this role, which is slightly odd to say considering he's the only character that actually smiles. In my opinion, he is the most interesting character in the entire movie, with a good backstory and a proper motivation behind why it is that he's doing what he's doing. All of which gets better developed in the prequel, which is a little bit of a shame for this one. As for the rest of the characters, I'll admit there's not that much to them. Most of them have maybe one or two things to do, but not much else. There is a pretty decent cast with a mix of known and not so known faces, but there isn't much that helps them stand out. They just don't have any distinct personalities, which is a bit of a shame because you could really have some fun with this. The characters that do stand out, partly because they get more screen time, include the writer Kevin Grievo, who has the deepest and most epic voice I have ever heard. There's this really creepy doctor as well, played by Erwin Leder, because you always need a creepy doctor in these kind of movies. And there's also Sophia Myles, who plays Erica, who does what she does for reasons. You know what, I don't think they actually addressed that. There is one other character that I do need to mention. That is a character called Craven, played by Shane Brolly. No, the other one. Thank you. Craven is the guy who thinks he's in charge after being handpicked by Viktor to be steward for the Vampire Coven. So there's always this big clash between him and Selene whenever she goes off to do her own thing. And I'll be honest, he's not my favourite character. He's very brooding, well, almost everyone seems to be in this. The performance from Shane isn't the best and can feel a little bit flat, but I think that might have something to do with the ADR, which can be noticeable for a few people. Plus, for an antagonist, he doesn't really provide that much threat. I don't mind him, and he does look kind of scary in like full vampire mode, but I'll be honest, I'm just not invested in his character. They do try and do something interesting with him, with a twist that I won't spoil for anyone who hasn't seen this movie. But personally, I think they unveil it just a little bit too early. It makes sense when it takes place within the story because there is a lot that needs to happen after it takes place. But I don't think that there's any real sort of build up to it, so there's not that much shock when it does happen. There's another scene that follows it where Selene is reading about the history of the war, and I think that they should have swapped these two scenes around to add to the build up. I know it's a bit nitpicky, but that's just how I felt. What I did like about Underworld though is the look and style that they've gone for. It's got this great gothic vibe with really muted colours, like a permanent blue filter over everything, plus the movie is more or less completely set at night with a few rain sequences throughout. There was a moment where I did find myself saying, wait, has there been any day scenes? And there isn't. There's only one brief flash of daylight during a flashback, if you pardon the pun. But that's it, there's no daylight scenes whatsoever in this movie. It makes sense considering what creatures are in this movie, so I don't have any problem with it. The only thing that I will say though is that it does make it a little bit harder to determine how much time has actually passed over the course of the movie because there's nothing to really sort of break up those scenes. I think the movie takes place over a few days or nights even, or at least it's supposed to, but because the continuous night never gets broken up, it appears to take place over one solitary night. I could be completely wrong here, but I do think that they could have done something to just indicate that in some way. I mean, like the Blade movies use like a fast time lapse to show progression in time, so I think that they could have incorporated something like that in this and it wouldn't take too long to do. Anyway, this is a movie that does actually look pretty good with some really decent visuals, and I will admit there are some scenes and some shots in this movie that do feel very reminiscent of a comic book panel. So much so that I needed to look into whether or not this movie was actually based on anything, so when I started looking into it, that's when I found out about the Romeo and Juliet inspiration. But outside of that inspiration, this is not based on any kind of source material. This movie is completely original. That said, it is pretty obvious what movies helped inspire the look and style of this film, with things like The Matrix being a pretty big one, with the costumes, the music, and so much slow-mo I think even Zack Snyder would be proud. And then of course Blade, which, come on, Absolutely. In fact, I believe the producers wanted to do a crossover with the Blade franchise, but Marvel shut that down because they had plans for him. Probably just as well. I don't think they would have lasted very long against him. I suppose this is a good enough time to talk about the action. Underworld features a load of fights and shootouts and even a car chase, and it's okay. There is a very stylised approach to these action sequences with lots of slow-mo shots, quick editing and wire work that does work overall. But these to me are where the influences from those other movies is the most prominent. There are some fun sequences sprinkled throughout. It mostly does stick to just shootout sequences, but for the final act it does become more about the monsters with a properly vicious scrap between the main characters, where they start using more unique weapons, the fist fights become more brutal and graphic, and it's genuinely pretty good. That final battle is probably my favourite sequence of the entire movie, but I'll be honest, I was expecting a lot more like it throughout this film. It can also feel a little bit staged as well, potentially because the actors only had a few weeks to train how to do everything, and that's just a big no-no for something like this. That said, the stunt work is actually pretty good and does manage to keep the action fairly grounded without relying too much on effects. A lot of it does come from the wire work, which is used quite a bit throughout this, with werewolves climbing along walls, Selene jumping from tall buildings and just walking the landing off. That was pretty awesome. And even my favourite stunt with Lucian chasing down a car, and it does look really cool. Most of the practical stuff that they do use in this movie does look really good overall, especially from a design perspective when it comes to like the set designs and even like the makeup and costumes. It adds a layer of believability, history and a visual style that helps separate who everyone is, with the Lycans wearing grimier clothes in dingy locations and the vampires wearing more posh, clean attire with grander mansions. I do need to quickly mention about the contact lenses as well, because like all the characters do wear some sort of contact lenses whenever it is that they do transform into either werewolves or vampires, and they do look really good, and it is pretty effective in making these characters actually start to look a little bit more scarier. And even like the prosthetic teeth that all the characters use, I do actually quite like that they do incorporate that as much as they can. But as I said, I do think that this is where the ADR really started to come in handy, because it does look like the teeth were a bit of an issue to deal with, so they had to dub a lot of these lines over. It doesn't take out the movie, it isn't too distracting or anything like that, but I do think that it is noticeable, and I think that they could have done something to improve it. But as for the Lycans themselves, the design of them in full wolf form and how one other creature looks is pretty alright. Plus the transformation scenes, which looks like a form of stop motion mixed in with some CG, actually are pretty cool and allows them to change faster than werewolves usually do. On its own though, the CGI that is used in this movie is a little bit dated. It looks okay for the time and it is used sparingly, but when it does become more prominent it can look like something from an older video game, and it is definitely noticeable. In all honesty, it did get me thinking that this world that the movie is set in would actually make for a pretty decent video game. I know they did make one in 2004, and from what I can tell it did get very mixed reviews, but with Unreal Engine and the power modern consoles have, I reckon they could make something really good, violent and scary with the right people involved. I do think that the effects are pretty alright overall, and I do appreciate that they do try and do as much for real as they can. I do have to mention, and this is the nitpicky side of me coming out again, I do think it is a little bit strange why it is that the vampires in this movie do actually have reflections. I know not every version does this, but considering this one does try and keep as many of the lore elements we know intact, right down to vampire reactions to UV light and werewolves burning when they touch silver, it does seem odd to not include it, especially how easy it would have been with the technology available. I know it's only a small thing, but I do think that maybe they could have acknowledged it somewhere. When it comes to the soundtrack for this movie, the score was composed by Paul Haslinger, and it's definitely from 2003. It's a very drum and bass oriented soundtrack mixed in with like church bells going off in the background as well to really sort of add to the gothic feel. And it does work overall. It isn't bad, but there isn't that much variety when it comes to a lot of the musical score throughout this movie, and I don't think that, especially when compared to a lot of the other movies that helped inspire it, I don't think that it's able to really sort of stand out on its own. It is definitely one of those atmospheric soundtracks that really kind of surround you whenever you've got headphones on. I didn't really notice this when I was watching it on TV the first time, but when I had headphones on, you really do notice how prominent it is. It can be a little bit strange at times, and I'll be honest, that does kind of go for the overall sound design that is used in this movie, but overall it is a decent soundtrack. I love the songs though, they are definitely up my street. So much so that I found it funny when one of the characters is transforming in the back of a police car and this thumping metal music is playing in the background and they turn it up to drown him out. And I just kept thinking, yeah, let's have a rave! It makes that scene way cooler, and it is a scene that you do remember. Overall, I think this is an entertaining film with some interesting ideas and a decent cast. There's some really cool designs, practical effects and a look and style style that does grab your attention. Where it lacks for me is the rather bland characters, the forced romance, the staged action sequences, and not as much monster action as you'd think there'd be. It is very clearly inspired by a number of similar and, in my opinion, better movies from around the time, and it is hard not to think of those films when you see this. That being said, I think this is a good enough film that does have some memorable moments and ideas, and I would say it's worth checking out if you have the chance. It's not fantastic and it won't be for everyone, but for fans of the supernatural, fans of action movies, horror, werewolves, vampires, Bill Nighy, Michael Sheen, or of course Kate Beckinsale, or if you're looking for something fun to watch over Halloween, I think that this is worth a look. So with all that said, my rating for Underworld is a 6 out of 10. I don't think this is a fantastic movie by any means, but I do think that it is watchable and I can understand why it has developed a fan base. Well, I think that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so thank you very much for watching this video if you have. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you have seen Underworld, let me know down in the comments what you think about it, plus what is your favourite movie in the franchise. And if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like me to do, let me know down below. Halloween season has just begun, so keep an eye out for more spooky content over the next few weeks. But until then, thank you very much for watching and I will see you next time on Rewind Reviews. Happy Halloween.